All right. Welcome back, everyone. We are extremely excited to dive into our next session, the human side of investing and how to trust your gut in investment decisions, with the renowned Dan Ariely, world leading social scientist and best selling author. In this session, Dan will guide us through the fascinating intersection of human behavior and investing. We often think of investing as a purely analytical process, but as Dan will show us, understanding our own biases is key to making smarter investment decisions. He'll introduce to us the human capital factor, a powerful metric that reflects how employees feel about their companies, and explain why this can be a game changer in identifying high performing investments. Now, before we jump in, just a little bit of housekeeping rules. I'd like to remind everyone to engage in the chat, share your thoughts, and don't hesitate to ask questions during the session in the Q&A box. We'll have time towards the end of the session for our guest speaker, Dan, to answer your questions. Now, let's get started. Dan, great to have you here. How are you doing today?
Very mixed. On a personal level, I feel I'm in a very creative period in my life. My first kids book came out and I'm working on a TV show, but the world is crazy. And I'm trying to figure out how do I manage in this crazy world? What can I learn? What can I study? Where do we need to take steps for improvement? But the more time I spend reading the news, the more baffled I am.
I think I can relate as well. So I completely understand. Well, look, today we're talking about behavioral investing. You know, it's always been a growing and an emerging topic in the investing world. So my first kind of question to you is we all, hear about behavioral biases and so on, but I want to get your thoughts on this. So how do behavioral biases typically influence investor decision making? And then what strategies can individuals use to recognize, perhaps more importantly, to overcome these biases?
Yeah. So maybe I'll start by giving you my metaphor for the human mind. And my metaphor is that the human mind is like a vintage Swiss Army knife. Vintage Swiss Army knife. So let's start with the Swiss Army knife. What do I mean by that? The Swiss Army knife is not particularly good at anything. There's not a task that you would say, I need a screwdriver, let me get the Swiss Army knife. I need the tweezers, let me get the Swiss Army knife. No, the Swiss Army knife does lots of things, sort of okay, in a very compact way. And our mind is a little bit like this. We're not particularly good in anything. AI is proving that, but we're good in lots of things in a relatively compact way. But my metaphor is not Swiss Army knife, it's a vintage Swiss Army knife. What do I mean by vintage? Our minds evolve in a different era. Our evolutionary history is very different from the environment we live in now. And we have all kinds of tools that were very, very useful in that period. For example, things about fear from animals, or looking at dots and reconnecting them. Being loss averse, being afraid of losing. We have lots of tools in our vintage Swiss Army knife that were developed evolutionary for good reason, but now we bring them to today. That's what we have to deal with. We have these tools that are not so good, but still, those are the tools we have, and we have to do with them. So what does that mean? Let's take emotion, for example. Emotion is a way for nature to tell us to act without thinking. You see a tiger, run. You see food with high sugar and fat content, eat. Don't take out an Excel spreadsheet and start thinking about this. And we still have emotions. Greed and fear are still with us, but they're not serving us. They're not serving us well. So we have to understand that our natural way of processing information is not the right way for the modern era, and certainly not correct for the stock market, which inherently is about money and about long-term thinking. You want to trust your emotions, trust them about which art or which food you like. Don't trust them about what to invest. So now the question is, what can we do? And one way is to say, let's train people to do better. Uh, that's going to be very, very tough. Maybe the Dalai Lama is able to overcome some of his biases by, practicing so many hours of meditations and so on. For most of us, our tools are not necessarily getting us, our intuition is not getting us to do well, and we need tools that get us to think better. And I'll give you just one example. I guess I'll give you two. Imagine for all of you that I went tonight into your portfolios and I sold everything. Sold everything. And tomorrow you wake up and everything is in cash. You didn't lose a dime. How many of you would buy tomorrow exactly what you had yesterday? Most people would say, not exactly. In fact, there are some things I'm doing that I wouldn't do again. Now, this is one example of a bias where we're kind of prisoners to our past self. And when we get a chance for a new page, we make different decisions. Our decisions in the stock market should only be about moving from here forward, but we have a very hard time not to think about the decision going backward. Which price did I buy that stock? If I sell it now, am I gaining, realizing a gain or a loss? Now, do I think that all of you should sell everything and rebuy once a year or twice a year? Of course not. But should we do the mental exercise of saying, if I had now everything in cash, what would I buy and what not? And the things that we wouldn't buy, maybe we should we should sell. So that's one example. I'll give you another one. Bubbles are very easy to create. Bubbles are people's tendency to follow the herd. Things are going up, we buy. Things are going down, we sell. It's a very unhealthy instinct to follow the herd because we end up buying high and selling low. But it's a very, very good. It's a very bad instinct, and trying to fight it is very important. Now, what are the tools for this? I think one tool would be for my broker not to show me my current position. My current position and the historical prices are about history. I think that the first page on everybody's brokerage account should be to get them to think about the future. It's kind of amazing that we're bombarded with information about the past. That's not the right information. So I would say, don't open your portfolio, see what you lost, what you gained, have your emotions play out, and then make a decision. Think in advance before you look at the portfolio. Ideally, get your brokerage to change the way they present information, and get them to present information in a way that gets you to think about the future and not be influenced about the past. And another interesting strategy is to rebalance. Now, if you think about it, what rebalancing does, yes, it gets you to be consistent with your risk attitude, but it really gets you to be more, to buy low and sell high. So imagine you're at 50-50, stocks and bonds. And imagine that stocks are high and bonds are low, and now you're at 60-40. If you rebalance, what does it mean to rebalance? It means you're going to sell stocks and buy bonds. You're going to sell what's high and buy what's low. So it's interesting that rebalancing has the benefit of staying consistent with your risk attitude. But I think that even more than that, it's an interesting self-discipline exercise of forcing us to sell high and buy low. If our stock went up to 60 and our bonds went out to 40, we don't want to sell what's going so well. But if you say, twice a year I'm going to rebalance, you basically force yourself by a rule to overcome your natural instincts. Oh, I think stocks are going to go even higher, let me stay with it. No, it's a discipline move. So that's my first answer.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Dan, for that. I have a follow-up on, when you say it would be ideal, and I fully agree that the brokerage displays things on your investments related to the future. Can you maybe give us some examples of what kind of information we're talking about? So maybe for a stock, it could be forecasted earnings growth, but I guess the problem is those forecasts are made by analysts who are also prone to a lot of biases. So what kind of
That's right.
information are you referring to over here?
So I think first, some of that information could be analyst as well. So imagine I take the first page on your brokerage account would be your top 10 positions. It would be the expectations from analysts. And next to them, I will ask you to put your expectations. Look, eventually as an individual, you're working based on your expectations. And it's fine for you to have expectations. If you think that the right place to invest is company X because it's underappreciated, go ahead and do that. But I want you to do that because you think company X is going to beat expectations, and to think that that's not because you look at the historical price and you say to yourself, oh, I bought it at 100, it was a 90, it got back to 100, let me get rid of it now, or something like that. So I think that the whole focus, eventually, look, if you don't think that you have any additional information, don't buy and sell specific things. Put money in the long term and that's it. But if you think, probably to some degree wrongly so, that you have some unique knowledge, I want you to focus on that. And by the way, my expectation is that if people thought about it and they said, okay, let's imagine you open your brokerage account and I show you your 10 biggest position, and maybe I show you some positions you don't have. Maybe I show you your biggest 10 position and I show you the top 10 largest companies that you're not investing in. And I just ask you, which one of those do you think is going to have the highest growth in the next year? Most likely you would say, I don't know. So if you don't know, it's good, it's fine. Just admit that you don't know. What does it mean? Invest broadly. You don't know. So I think we need to encourage thinking about the future. I think we need to encourage what's called intellectual humility. I don't know. There was a paper by Terry O'Dean. It was quite many years ago, but he showed that women were better investors than men. And what was the reason? They just didn't trust themselves to the same degree. Men were too overconfident and they kept on switching stocks and they kept on losing money because of that. And there was also a quote by somebody at Fidelity many years ago in one of the newspapers. And he said that they look at the database and they found some investors who were just amazing. And they wanted to see what made those investors be so good. And they found out that they were dead. People who are dead don't change their portfolio so much. They're less likely to, sell high and buy high and sell low. So, I think that there are some experts out there, but for most of us, I think the strategy of saying, let me recognize that I don't really know, let me be more modest, let me have a broad exposure portfolio is the right approach.
I am not sure how some really highly paid investment managers are going to feel about dead people outperforming them, but I can fully understand, and that's a very funny analogy. And in terms of also your advice on kind of writing down your expectations, I think that's extremely valuable, and I think it's kind of related. It has a hidden piece of advice in it, which is writing down your investment thesis, right, and then constantly testing it. And if it
That's
breaks
right.
down, exit the stock, right? You have no reason to own it anymore.
Yeah, and also, we my research center at Duke is called the Center for Advanced Hindsight, because we are so good in explaining things to ourselves in hindsight. Say, oh yes, I knew that all along. If you knew it all along, why didn't you commit to this? Oh yes, I knew that Bitcoin is going to reach $100,000. Really, you knew. So I think it's good. It's good to write these predictions, and it's good to confront our own knowledge, and to also create rules. If this goes above this, I'll sell, and so on.
Absolutely. Hindsight is a perfect science, as the saying goes. Dan, I want to delve into a metric you helped pioneer, which is the human capital factor. So, can you kind of explain this to us? And how does assessing employee sentiment provide insights into a company's performance that traditional financial metrics might miss?
Yeah. So first of all, every CEO stands on the stage and say, "My people are the most important thing I have." But there are two questions. The first one is, do they act this way? Do they just say it, or do they really act? And the second thing is, do they really know what it means to treat people well? Social science is full with things that people don't think would matter, but matter, and full with things that people think would matter, but don't. So the question is, do they act on this? People are the most important thing I have, and do they do the right thing? Do they know even what's the right thing? So we got data going back to 2006 about how people feel about their companies. And we did a study when we looked at the data from 2006 and predicted the stock market return for 2007. And the data from 2007 predicted the stock market return for 2008. And we found that lots of things didn't matter. Salary didn't make a big difference. Health benefits didn't make a big difference. Retirement benefits didn't make a big difference. But we found that some things mattered a lot. For example, one of the things that mattered the most was, do you feel appreciated? Company, when people felt more appreciated, ended up paying higher alpha. A company that had higher psychological safety, companies that had lower bureaucracy. I told you already that salary doesn't matter so much. It turns out that fairness in salary matters a lot. So we took the things that mattered and we combined them together into what we call the human capital factor, which is to say, if you think about the engine of growth of companies, sometimes things happen, and AI is a big deal, and right now, and electricity will probably be next when we figure out how much electricity we need and so on. So sometimes there are sector movements, but if you ask what is the engine of growth for companies, it's people who care. It's people who do above and beyond. It's people who mentor others. It's people who find problems and solve them. It's people who, work extra hard. That's the engine of growth. If you think about the company like an engine, and you say, how is the company that treating its employees working? Oops. I hear some noise. I don't know if you hear that noise. But how does a company that treats its employees working? It's like a well-oiled machine. And if company doesn't treat their employees well, it's like a machine with lots of sand and all kinds of challenges. So what we found is that the human capital performance predicts score predicts stock market return. Now I do want to say one other thing about this. Sometimes when I present this data on Wall Street, people say to me, "I want hard numbers," and I tell them, "No, you don't. For many things you want hard number, but for human capital you don't." And I say, look, if I ask you how much you love your significant other, I can't measure it by how many little love icons you send them during the day. Your love is, you're the best candidate to tell me how much love you feel to your significant other, and all the objective measures are not going to be true. They're going to be a very biased measure of that. Similarly, if I ask you how much pain you feel, I can measure your neuroactivity. It's not going to give me the right measurement. So what we really want is we want this subjective feeling. How much in love do I feel? How much pain do I feel? So I think we need to integrate it. And the last comment I will say is that when companies buy a warehouse, it's an investment. When companies treat their employees well, it's a cost. I think all companies should start thinking about human capital. I think, yes, we can't use it in the accounting world yet, but I think companies should start thinking very carefully about their human capital and think about how do we develop and invest in our human capital.
Amazing, makes perfect sense. Thank you so much for that, Dan. And perhaps kind of final question on that before we move over to audience Q&A, which reminds me for everyone tuning in, feel free to put your questions in the Q&A box. So kind of summarizing this, human capital factor, what have your, studies and research showed in terms of company performance? So how do companies that have high human capital factors rate or perform, their stock prices perform relative to those that have a low human capital factor?
Yeah. So we found that there's a signal for the 20% companies who are treating the employees the best. We found that there's a signal for the 20% companies who treat their employees worse. I mean, you can short those companies. We don't, but you could. So in general, the signal is in both directions. And what was also interesting was that the signal increased during COVID. And if you think about why, imagine a seventh grade student in a classroom. If the seventh grade student is not paying attention, the teacher can say, sit straight, don't talk to Johnny, put your phone down. If the kid is at home with Zoom, they can just turn the teacher off. And we are not kids, but we're also a little bit like kids. When I ask people to admit how many of us during COVID or during work from home pretended the internet is not working so well and turn the video off and do other things, most people admit that they've done it a couple of times. So what that means is that during COVID and also when people work from home, people are at their own discretion to a higher degree. In the office, we have glasses, open spaces, all kinds of things. When people are in a meeting in the office, they pay attention. They can't just be on their phone. So the role of the human motivation side is increasing when people work from home. And to the extent that this is here to stay, I think that the role of human capital has increased even further. And if you want to look at it, we have a couple of indexes with Harbor Capital, and you can check those out and see the performance over the last few years. And I think it's very nice. It's a very nice performance.
Very, very fascinating. Thank you so much for that, Dan. I want to switch over to
I'll say one more thing. Where's why do we get this performance? My sense, my metaphor for this is it's like rain on coffee plantations. When you have coffee plantation, at some point you have the coffee and you have a signal of how good the coffee is. If you get the rain, you know how good the coffee will be a little earlier because you can predict it. I think human capital is a little bit like that. At some point, companies come up with improved procedures and better products and so on, and everybody in the market can see them. But if you can observe human capital, you can observe the conditions that will get that going. So you basically have an early look into the way that companies are likely to develop.
Makes perfect sense. Thank you so much. So switching over a little bit to audience Q&A, we have one question basically asking, how can investors balance being data-driven while also trusting their instincts?
I don't know why people should trust their instincts. Look, when are instincts correct? I think we have good instincts when it comes to things like basketball. You shoot baskets and you do it a lot, and you get immediate, highly accurate feedback. So when the ball leaves your hand, you have kind of a sense of whether it's going in the right direction or not. So for things that we have repeated interactions with good immediate feedback, you have good instincts. For things that nature have prepared us, be afraid of snakes, you have good instincts. We have cells, and birds have even more, that are responsible for detecting snakes. So, there are some things in nature that we have really good instinct. Like you detect a snake, you don't even know, and you're already afraid. But for lots of other things, I don't think we have the conditions that will develop good instincts. Dating. Are people good at this? No. We don't have a lot of experience. We don't have good immediate feedback. The learning cycle is not that good. Also with stocks, like where would you get good instincts? Based on what? What is the feedback? So for me, I would say that most things that are not like basketball, where we have a lot of good, like chess players, they get a sense, oh, it's going in the right direction. Like I don't know exactly where, but I know that this is a move in the right direction. I think there are very few like this, very few things like that I would say, trust your instincts. Most things I would say, trust your instincts less.
Makes sense. And this question is perhaps a follow-up to that, or really trying to, understand if there's any instincts you should trust. Because the question is basically asking, are there any natural processes, any instincts that are good for investing?
No. I think that the only good one that we have for investing is investing in ourselves. So if you say, do we have good instincts for stocks? No. Bonds? No. Cryptocurrency? No. I think the only thing we have good instinct is investing in our own human capital, figuring out what we're good at, figuring out what we're not so good at, planning our career. Let me get better at the things I'm not so good at. Let me do more of the things that I'm exceptional at. I think those are the things that we have a sense, a really good sense of where we are. So that asset category of yourself, I think, is the only asset category that we have reasonable instincts about, and then we need to follow them.
Makes sense. Thank you very much for that, Dan. Perhaps one last question before we run out of time. This question is basically asking, what are the most common psychological challenges you've seen clients face, and how are they addressed?
So it's a long question. So I'll answer one thing. I think one of the interesting challenges is the process of decumulation. You have people that have some money, but money is running out, and sometimes the amount of money that they take out of their saving is higher than the interest, and that creates a tremendous negative feeling. And we've seen people do all kinds of crazy things. We've seen people cut their pills into half and not going to movies. People are basically afraid that they will outlive their money. Now, many people could indeed outlive their money. I'm not saying that everybody is immune from this problem, but I would say that one of the big challenges is to help people figure out the decumulation stage. What's a reasonable activity in that realm? How much should you spend? What's reasonable? When should you stop worrying about spending?
Amazing. Thank you so much for that, Dan. I think we are, approaching the end of the session. As always, extremely valuable insights. That was really, really enlightening. The human side of investing, I think something we should all be paying attention to. As always, Dan, your insights into behavioral finance, extremely fascinating. And I'm sure everyone will agree that understanding our biases and the people, behind the companies we invest in, something we don't really think about, can really transform our decision-making process. So as we wrap up, I really encourage everyone attending to reflect on how you can apply these principles to your own strategies moving forward. Dan, on behalf of myself, Finimize, and the entire community and everyone attending, thank you so much for that talk, for all your really, really valuable insights. So for everyone else, please stay tuned for our next session on Alternatives Goes Mainstream with the CEO of iCapital. We'll be back in around 15 minutes, so stay tuned. You don't want to miss it. Thank you very much, and have a good afternoon.